Hey everybody, Alex Kapitko here, Centered from Reality podcast. It is Tuesday night. I was going to wait to put this episode out until Wednesday, but I feel like there were just some things that I needed to cover now because, well, as I'm sure all of you are aware, things are constantly changing at this point, and I wanted to get this out tomorrow. I still may be doing a podcast as well on some other more domestic issues, but to get right to the point here is that since Friday, when I did the episode on the fire hose of falsehood and what I think Putin's trying to do with the international community, well, things are really escalating right now between Russia, Ukraine, and I guess the rest of us who have to now make a pretty quick decision on how to respond. And by the rest of us, I mean our leaders and the international community, not me specifically. But over the weekend, obviously, there were talks of Russia basically inciting and fueling conflicts between some of the other separatist movements in eastern Ukraine as a pretext for war, right? And I kind of alluded to this, but now we're seeing it happen again. Obviously, this happened in 2014 in Crimea, where you don't really have to actually start the conflict if you're Russia. You just need to basically incite enough potential for conflict amongst these separatist movements that are pro-Russian, and then basically say if those groups are attacked or if there's a conflict against these groups, then you're just going in to protect these groups as an apparatus of Russia. And that seems to be what has happened. Over the weekend, there was already reports of shelling on the eastern region, and these separatist movements already starting to instigate something. And this was giving Russian officials a pretext for war. And now, as of Tuesday night, it looks like the worst of all of our fears have come true, right? That Putin has technically invaded Ukraine and seems to clearly have decided that the war option is the better one for him over the less costly alternatives. And Foreign Policy magazine from Tuesday morning, when I saw it, reported that Putin has set troops into the separatist regions of Ukraine, so mainly the east. And according to the article, the Biden administration is now in talks with some of the economic powerhouses in Asia to gain their support for severe sanctions and export control packages against Russia, which I guess is kind of the first step, and I guess at this point the most rational step, because we don't want to go to war. And Biden has at this time said we're not sending more troops. And I would imagine that if he changed his mind on that, it would be quite detrimental domestically in the United States. And so Foreign Policy mentions that Washington so far has received support from Singapore, Japan, and Taiwan for plans to implement restrictive export controls on Russia. And that would mainly be in the forms of natural gas and standard gas. And disclaimer before I keep going, I'm keeping this episode fairly broad and more about the general trends so far we're seeing in the conflict, because things are changing. And it really isn't time for hot takes from people like me, because we need to understand that by the time this comes out, the specifics might change. But I'm more focused on the general dynamics so we can try to understand how to respond, because this is not going to change. What I mean is the general dynamics are not going to change overnight, at least I hope. So anyways, it's pretty wild to me that we have arrived at this point, because I think any rational person, myself included, thought that this was just Putin flexing at the time. But it really has gone past that point now. And yeah, I'll admit I was wrong. I thought he wanted to be heard and was willing to kind of scale down this conflict after there was a promise that Ukraine, for the time being, would not be part of NATO. But that does not seem to be the case. So on Monday, Putin had a very interesting and probably telling speech on Russian state television, and it was about Ukraine. And I found it fascinating because we really got to see what Putin actually wants. And for the first time, he didn't seem like this masterminding world leader who has a bigger picture in mind. He instead seemed like this angry and desperate nationalist that was spewing grievance politics. And also, it should be noted that I believe he was drinking during this, and maybe that was part of this kind of anger that came out of him and this kind of careless rhetoric that was coming out of him. But it was worrying because the speech showed me that he may be willing to do more than we first thought. And I'm going to go over just some takeaways from the speech. So, and again, it's all in Russian. I've just read on a various amount of news sites the general interpreted takeaways from the speech, because I don't speak Russian. I'm assuming most of you don't speak Russian. So I'm just going to give you the takeaways. And so I think the first thing that Putin said in this speech, which was worrying to say the least, is that he immediately recognized independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. And remember, these are some of these regions in Ukraine that do have Russian speakers, and if you were to poll the country, you would find people that are more willing to be part of Russia. They would all be in these regions. And there are separatist movements that I would argue the Kremlin has helped incite and make the situation worse, but that's not we're not going to dive into all of that today. But this is obviously important that Putin said this, because now the Russian Federation can use any attacks against these separatist movements as a pretext to actually go defend them, and a pretext of aggression against these Russian peoples. Because basically he is saying, okay, well, there's these Russian separatist movements in Ukraine, and they are Russian people, and we need to defend Russian people anywhere that they need help, even if they're in a different country. He then, in the speech, continued to say that Ukraine really was never an independent country. He said that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, more precisely the Bolshevik communist Russia around 1917, and that Vladimir Lenin was a crucial creator of Ukraine. Again, this creates a very historically inaccurate but effective narrative that Ukraine was a product of Russia. And I've mentioned this a few times on the podcast. I read that book, Red Famine, by Anne Applebaum. And it was about how the reason why Russia put down such an iron fist under Lenin to Ukraine was because they were, at that time, in the 1917 era, they were afraid of Russian independence from Russia. Ukrainian independence from Russia. And so, just by reading that book, I can tell you that it is not true that Ukraine's never been an independent country. Ukraine has always been historically different and culturally different in some ways from Russia. But again, there has been an intermixing. Don't get me wrong. Like, they do have a shared history, but they are not just the same people because they live next to each other and both speak Slavic languages. It's not that simple. And so by Putin creating this narrative that Ukraine was a product of Russia, it really gives an open door to Russia for getting in there, to be honest. Because if you don't believe Ukraine is a state, then it makes it a lot easier to go in there and annex them or partition the state, right? And in the speech, he also went even further to say that Ukraine never had a traditional, genuine statehood, blah, blah, blah. And it's a talking point from Russian autocrats for generations, going back to the Bolshevik days. Even prior to the Bolshevik days, there's always been this talking. And this tells me that this is not about modern politics as much as this is a very big nationalist vein that Putin is appealing to. And it also feeds the propaganda for invasion. I also want to read one section from his speech because I think it shows the lens that Putin is looking at. So this translated part of his speech, he says in quotes here, "I pay special attention to the fact that the danger of a sudden strike against our country will increase many times over. Let me explain that U.S. strategic planning documents contain the possibility of a so-called preemptive strike against enemy missile systems. And who is the enemy for the U.S. and NATO? We know that too. It's Russia. In NATO documents, our country is officially and directly declared the main threat to the North Atlantic security. And Ukraine will serve as a forward springboard for the strike. If our ancestors had heard about it, they probably would simply have not believed. And today we don't want to believe it, but it's true." So he did a really powerful propagandist technique here. Of course the West has Russia as the biggest threat. They're the ones that have getting closer to 200,000 troops on the border. It's not NATO who's doing that. But it's Putin's way of being the aggrieved side here, saying, look, they're targeting Russia. They're the ones who are treating us as an enemy. But I think any rational person should sit back and say, why is NATO focusing on Russia as a major threat? But that's, of course, not in Putin's narrative. And now he is, I think quite effectively saying, see, NATO's focused on Russia and Russian people, and we need to respond to this because it's about our existence. It's a very strong nationalist technique, and he uses it quite well here. And anyways, this speech was just problematic to me because Putin seemed different in this speech. He seemed kind of dead and numb. to the reality of violence and instead kind of accepted this fate. And it's a different tone from him. And I don't watch a lot of his speeches, believe me, because I don't speak Russian. And I'm sure he speaks English, but the majority of his speeches are always in Russian. But for a man who seems strategic, I was shocked. His ranting sounded like those of a nationalist autocrat who is leading a waning power, and he's afraid. And when a bear like that is in a corner, we should be worried. I did read a good piece today in The Atlantic by Tom Nichols, who's an academic specialist on international affairs. He's currently a professor at the U.S. Naval War College, and he really has some good takes on this type of stuff because, he's well-versed in it, so you would hope so. But in his piece called Putin Chooses a Forever War, he really explains my feelings on this and I think brings up some good points. He shares my worries about Putin's motives after hearing what he calls this unhinged speech on Monday. But he also goes into some points that are worth mentioning real quick. He discusses how it isn't uncommon for an invading leader to try and rewrite history about the country they're trying to invade. Nichols in this article notes that Putin's claims are hardly different from what Saddam Hussein's rewriting of Middle Eastern history looked like when they invaded Kuwait, trying to erase Kuwait's ethnic diversity and these diverging narratives, right? It's easier to invade a neighboring country if you decouple your divergent histories, I guess you could say. And this seems like an obvious point, but is important because an autocrat needs the people to at least follow or be complacent. And appealing to a shared nationalist cause can really be helpful. Also, Nichols goes on. He writes that, in quotes here, Putin is now embracing a Russian tradition of paranoia and inferiority complex that sees Moscow as both a savior of other nations and a victim of great conspiracies. The reality is an interesting form of crafting a reality where Russia's enemies are damned if I do, damned if I don't. And like I kind of touched on Friday, is that this is part of the fire hosing effect that Putin's been so great at, and other Russian autocrats have been great at, is you simplify it down, but you also make people question what is right or wrong. And it's working really well here. And Nichols, later in the article, also discusses that by recognizing the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine as the people's republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, Putin has effectively partitioned Ukraine already. And this is where Nichols worries that things really have escalated and there isn't really a turning back from a war here. He says that, Putin has now affirmed that he refuses to accept the outcome of the Cold War era and that he will fight to dismantle the European system of peace and security. This is Vladimir Putin's forever war, Nichols writes. And Russia, cursed as it has been so many times in its history, will be fighting for it as long as Putin remains the master of the Kremlin. And the sad thing is here is, I think it was Charlie Sykes on The Bulwark who said that Russia is just a gas station with nukes. I think that's true. The Russian economy is not doing well. But the thing is, they have a lot of people, and they have a lot of complacency and a lot of propaganda. And those things do not particularly end well. And now this gets kind of to the bigger issue here, is that Putin single-handedly is trying to gaslight, if I can use that term that's overused. He is basically making the entire international order that was developed be questioned. His drunken reasoning in that speech has created a rationale for statehood that no European country could really hold to. He basically has said that the Kremlin is the only body that can really judge what a sovereign nation is. And this is dangerous to our world and to the ideals of democracy. And, just even decouple democracy from that statement. It's dangerous to a stable world. Ukraine is a country. I can't even explain how true that is. But, of course, like a lot of Europe and the rest of the world, there are ethnic groups inside of countries that diverge from one another. And if we tried to partition countries in that same manner in other places, we would get back to that destabilized post-Renaissance era and up into the great wars in Europe before the American founding. And like I think of just some personal examples. Like when I was in Spain, Spain has many groups inside of their country, like the Basques and the Catalans, just to name two. France as well, Germany as well. What about the UK? Scotland, the Welsh people, the Irish, right? Of course, Ukraine has people that identify more with Russia, that speak Russian. This doesn't mean that Putin can just claim Ukraine isn't a country and then incite chaos in the Russian-speaking parts. The world that still supports democracy and order does need to stand up to this. I think it's crucial. And the bigger picture, if you zoom out a little bit, is that I'm sure China is watching. And I'm going to get into that later because I think China so far is taking a pragmatic approach. But China's been redrawing borders for years and redefining what nationhood means. They took Tibet, basically took Hong Kong. There's debate there, but the free and fair system of Hong Kong being separate but part of China hasn't really held up. And if Russia takes part of Ukraine, China could feel emboldened to do something with Taiwan. And not to be cliche, but as Martin Luther King Jr. said, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. And that's the destability that I think Putin is striving for in some ways. And yeah, that's problematic for all of us. I'll admit I was wrong. I thought Putin just wanted to be heard. And I guess in some ways from that speech, you could say he does want to be heard. But he wants more than that. And I've seen some awful takes on the crisis in the U.S. from both the right and the left. And it always kind of infuriates me because there's progressives that are isolationist and say we shouldn't do it. We need to focus on the economy and working class jobs and the inequality in this country. And that's all true. And at the same time, the new populist Trumpian right wing, the Tucker Carlson types and the Josh Hawleys, they've all bought into this Russian propaganda. I've heard so many people on both the kind of the extremes of both parties, basically recite the concept of Ukraine not being a country and there's parts that want to go to Russia, and why not just let that happen? Maybe the compromise is let Russia take parts of Ukraine. But I don't think they would stop there, and that's the thing. I feel like whenever, this is kind of a rule of thumb, I was talking with a buddy a few nights ago about this, I feel like whenever the far left and the far right agree on a very let me rephrase that. I feel like when the far left and the far right agree on an issue that's not black and white, maybe we need to not take it at its face value. Obviously, like I said, they are right in some ways. Like, why should we send troops to be worried about this conflict? But the issue is bigger than that, like I've kind of addressed here. There is the assumption that Ukraine shouldn't be protected. 538, though, has a good article that I wanted to mention, and I'm looking at it right now, and it kind of addresses this issue. I mentioned back when I did the Kazakhstan episode where I also discussed how Putin feels neglected and mistreated by NATO, and he wants kind of Russian glory again. I'd mentioned that Ukraine is actually getting more and more supportive and closer to the West because of the encroachment from Putin's regime in Russia. And this 538 article is called "War with Russia Has Pushed Ukrainians Toward the West." And it was written back on January 28th of last month. But the article starts by going over how, contrary to what Putin has claimed, the Ukrainian nation has been forming a stronger national identity over this time, including parts of the East. The article discusses the opinion of, I might butcher this name, Timofey Brick, who's a public opinion researcher and assistant professor at Kiev's School of Economics. And he says that, in quotes here, more people say that they feel strongly Ukrainian and they're proud to be Ukrainian citizens, even if they continue to speak the Russian language. There is a very strong feeling of national identity and sovereignty, end quotes. This seems a little contrary to what even some people in the U.S. media are saying. And the article makes it clear that this doesn't mean that Ukrainians are anti-Russian. Most Ukrainians, if you look at the polls, aren't in this 538 article. And in fact, up until 2008, they were still very supportive of the Russian government, but just didn't want to be annexed by Russia. And I'm looking at this one graph in this 538 article that basically shows how prior to the invasion of Crimea, a very small percentage of the population said Russia was a bad actor, while the majority of the country, by a very significant margin, said that Russia was mostly good. However, in 2014, you see this shift completely. There was where a very small majority of the country sees Russia as an adversary, and like if you look at this graph, it was like it was one of those ones where it's like, okay, so the top section was like, okay, Russia's fine, and there was a very small section on the bottom that said Russia's really bad. And then right when Crimea happens, these two cross over where about 55-45 are split on that, and the 55 being that, yeah, Russia's actually a bad actor, and we identify more with Ukraine. And that's a huge shift from very low margins of feeling disdain towards Russia into saying, no, we're Ukrainian. And a professor of comparative politics is quoted in this study, and he said it is because, in quotes here, what Putin is saying is that there is no such thing as Ukrainian nationhood, that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. But for us, what it means to be Ukrainian isn't about your ethnicity or your language, end quotes. And I guess the general takeaway here would be that it seems like Putin's annexation and attempts at creating discord have pushed the Ukrainian people away. And that's the interesting trend here, is that if you were buying into Putin's agenda and narrative, you would assume those numbers to go the other way, where the majority of these Ukrainians, especially in the East, were saying, no, please take us in, Putin. And they're not. And the same 538 paper looks at NATO. Survey data from Olga Anuch, a political scientist at the University of Manchester, shows that support for joining NATO has also increased substantially, from around 30% in May of 2014 to 55% in January 2021. Other surveys show also similar trends, and to me this shows that A, Putin's narrative is wrong, because a nation is a collective of people that share a common goal and a cultural ancestry, and this does seem to be the case in Ukraine. Also B, this information shows that these people at least have a slim majority in saying that they are Ukrainian over everything else. And Putin should be not able to take this from them, I guess, in a very broad sense. And this gets to me where I think these talking heads like Tucker Carlson are confused. And probably where a lot of the nation is in some ways. I know that Ukraine is different because Iraq, Afghanistan, right? There's a reason why, and a rightful reason why we don't trust our intelligence, and we don't trust conflicts, and we don't want to be involved in them. Because both of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan have just muddied the waters on what a just conflict is. And I know just is a loaded statement. But Iraq and Afghanistan were both wars that we should have not been involved in. The interests were maligned, and we tried to create democracy in places that just didn't want it. But Ukraine is different. Ukraine has a highly robust civil society. They have a populace that believes in democracy. And they got out of the Soviet Union. And like I've mentioned, the polls, it doesn't sound like they want to be back. I've also heard Kyiv, for example, has great clubs and a great just metropolitan area. I don't want all that taken away. But all jokes aside here, this is just different from other conflicts over the last 20 years we've been involved in. It's very different. I worry that Putin won't stop with Ukraine, too. He seems to want to rewrite history, right, of the post-Soviet era. And I think if I was in the Baltic states, especially like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, I would be worried. He wants Ukraine, not just the east of Ukraine. But he's using the East and the discord there to sow a pretext to go further. And when you have someone who's willing to overturn all the democratic and diplomatic norms and take what he wants, the situation is probably going to be worse. I tell people that Putin is not Hitler. He's not. And it's always questionable to compare that. But if you look at the historical context of it, he does have the same territorial aspirations and grievances, right? We never properly dealt with the Russian Federation after the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And I feel like it's given time for a very toxic nationalism to brew. And this is where we need to be realistic in the whole situation, in my opinion. Now, moving on before we're out of here, I think the probably more important set of questions revolve around what is next, right? Biden made it clear from the beginning that we are not sending more troops to that part of the world, at least at this time. And just for the context of this episode, we're going to hold that at face value. So as of now, we are going to try and use any other tactics. And I think this is good. But the big question going forward is, we really have to consider, is Putin someone who wants recognition, or is he a madman who wants territories? And I think that question is really what's going to drive our next steps going forward. There was a moment over the weekend where it seems like there was a chance for diplomacy. Biden had said that tentatively he would meet with Putin on the grounds that Putin didn't invade Ukraine. So they have technically invaded Ukraine. So I'm assuming this is off the table, right? I mean, it seems like that was kind of a line in the sand. But again, it gets windy on beaches and that line can go away. But my instinct is that Russia has been involved in the East for years, since the Crimean crisis in 2014, the annexation of Crimea. So he's already technically been invading Ukraine for a long time, whether it's through propaganda, aiding separatists, whatever it may be. So this muddles the waters a bit on like what we actually are trying to accomplish here. But my issue is that in that speech, Putin did mention Kiev and the potential of going further out of the East. And that's why I think it's bigger than just the East and these Russian territories in Ukraine. And if you're not watching, I'm putting up quotes there, Russian territories in Ukraine. But just today, CNN also reported that Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, says that the meeting with Sergei Lavrov is off after Russia moved on Ukraine. And apparently he was supposed to meet with Sergei Lavrov in Geneva this week. But he said in quotes here, now that we see the invasion is beginning and Russia has made clear its wholesale rejection of diplomacy, it does not make sense to go forward with that meeting at this time. And I think that's a good move, but it's a little too late. We need to, Putin, like I said, is playing four-dimensional chess, and we're playing rightful democracy and rightful diplomacy. And I think we should have been a little more hard-nosed earlier. This also does worry me, though, that the doors of diplomacy have been slammed shut. And as we know, when diplomacy fails, there's not a whole lot of other options. And like I said, I think these doors should have been challenged a long time ago with Russia, because we've known for years that they're not a good actor. Anne Applebaum, who wrote Red Famine, and she's one of the greatest authors, in my opinion, on kind of, the Soviet era and beyond, and their repression of people there. She has an article from The Atlantic, I think from 2 weeks ago, called Why the West's Diplomacy with Russia Keeps Failing. And she basically gives a scathing review of why our democracy isn't working and why Lavrov actually flourishes in it. And so I think it's good, side note, that Blinken is not going to meet with Lavrov again, because Lavrov flourishes in this discord and condescending rhetoric towards the West. She discusses how Lavrov, in quotes here, like Putin, uses aggression and sarcasm as tools to demonstrate his scorn for his interlocutor, to frame negotiations as useless even before they begin, to create dread and apathy. The point is to put other diplomats on the defensive, or else to cause them to give up in disgust. End quotes. She discusses how Putin and Lavrov have a history of lecturing foreign leaders, validating their Soviet-era grievances, and again, this goes back to Putin's speech I've talked about earlier. But Applebaum basically addresses that our diplomacy in general fails with Putin and his cronies like Lavrov, who I challenge you guys to look up all of his international dealings and his wealth. He is not what I would consider a diplomat. He seems like an oligarch crony. But anyways, she says that we have refused to see the representatives of this state for what they are. We have refused to speak to them in a way that might have mattered. Now it might be too late. I hate to say it, but I think she is right, because basically from what I gathered, because I was looking into Sergei Lavrov a few weeks ago when I read this article, is that his kind of strategy is actually not diplomacy and discussion. It's kind of it's basically kind of to lecture the West on what they're wrong about and why Russia's grievances are correct and why we need to listen to them. It's a very condescending lecturing format that works in Russia, but it just kind of sows discord for our diplomats. So, I mean, at this point, I don't really know what diplomacy would accomplish if you have a bad faith actor like Sergei Lavrov. I just don't know. So, that takes us to sanctions, right? Sanctions are our current solution. They're always our solution. I don't like sanctions personally, especially in Russia. They may put pressure on, I guess, the country as a metaphysical apparatus. But Putin and his fellow oligarchs and his fellow cronies like Lavrov have used the country as a piggy bank for years. I mean, there's numerous studies on that, numerous reports. I mean, Russian elites have also used the international banking system, right? They have property in New York and in London. They are fine. But I worry that sanctions would actually just hurt working people around the world, in Russia and in Europe and in the United States especially. And we're just going to see, I think, gas prices go up. That's not, I think, going to be good for anyone in the United States. As of now, the United States, the EU, and Britain have announced plans to target banks and elites, while Germany also did halt the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, I guess flows from the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, according to Reuters. Now, this could help because, obviously, like I said, Russian oligarchs and the Russian elite have used the international monetary system. So I guess halting bank accounts is a good step. But again, I don't really know if it's enough at this point. Like we've kind of gone past this. We've crossed the Rubicon. And I don't also like, okay, so the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, for example. I was listening to a podcast last week where they were talking about how Europe, especially Northern Europe, is really not prepared for an alternative source of fuel in the winter months. They would have to completely redesign all of their at-home heating, all of how they get fuel, and this just doesn't happen overnight. So there really isn't an alternative for a lot of Europe during these winter months. So who does that hurt? I don't think it hurts Putin. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we also have Singapore, Japan, and Taiwan who have signed on in pushing for economic restrictions and export controls. But again, if Russia's one of the leaders in fossil fuels and natural gas, they're exporting it. Okay, so we hurt them, but what if people also get hurt by that? I don't think this will work. So I think we need to wait and see, but we also need to, I think, remember at the end of the day, and I hate to say this, but I think China is important in this. Because China is Putin's probably closest ally at this point. And China and Russia have a lot of good coal deals and a lot of good cooperation in their energy sectors. So again, I don't know if sanctions would totally hurt Russia that much. Luckily, China doesn't have actually the same radical agenda as Putin has. China's envoy to the United Nations on Monday actually called for all parties to exercise restraint and avoid fueling tensions. Now, they did stop short of condemning the Kremlin and the recognition of independence in Ukraine. And I think, weirdly enough, China's kind of on a fine line here because clearly China ideologically identifies more with Russia. But they also need, I think, global stability for what they're trying to accomplish on a more meta-international level. So I think this is interesting because China really is in a tough place. And unfortunately, China's view of peace is arguably just about stability over democracy. And that's a fine line they have to balance. You know, China had urged parties involved in the crisis to go back to the Minsk agreements, But as I've mentioned, those are just a pretext for Russia getting partitions out of Ukraine. The Minsk agreements are flawed. It's basically a way for Putin to be able to take what he wants and Ukraine to not stand up or ever join NATO. Like, the Minsk agreements are very lopsided towards Putin. So it's complicated, but I'm going to wrap it up with that today just because I just wanted to paint my thoughts here about going forward. Because I think we need to understand that this is bigger than just where are we sending troops and are we just being an imperial power again, and why are we doing this when we have so many issues in the U.S.? Because I think it's bigger than this, because we're clearly seeing a breakdown in the post-Cold War era international order. And autocrats are talking, and I don't think Putin would stop with just the east of Ukraine, and I think we need to remember that. Anyways, I'll be back later in this week with episodes not about Ukraine, and probably some touch-ups on Ukraine. But you can find me on Twitter. Let me know your thoughts, Alex Kapitko, on there. Also, Centered from Reality Podcast, Apple iTunes, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, YouTube, all that jazz. Take care, guys, and hopefully we'll have some positive news for you next time. But right now, there's just so much up in the air. Have a good night.